Hi, this is Module 8. Today we're going to be talking about the relationship between physical activity as an exposure and mortality as an outcome. And you'll notice that we're going to start spending the next several modules talking about physical activity and its relationship to a variety of different outcomes. So first let's define mortality, specifically all-cause mortality. Most of the studies looking at the relationship between physical activity and mortality use all-cause mortality as the specific outcome. Occasionally they'll do some mortality from a particular cause. Usually it's cardiovascular disease mortality, but it can be maybe cancer mortality or mortality from some specific disease. It might be due to accidents or something like that. Because mortality is an endpoint that develops over time, the cohort design is the easiest to use because, again, with a cohort design, what you do is you take a group of people and follow them over a long period of time. So almost all of the evidence that we have about the relationship between physical activity or exercise and mortality is based on studies using this cohort design. Life expectancy varies somewhat around the world. This table from your textbook shows the life expectancy in men in rank order from 1 to 20. And so what you see is that life expectancy for men is highest in Iceland, Hong Kong, Japan, and so on and so forth. The United States falls out of the top 20. The average life expectancy for men in this country is around 75 years. For women, the countries in order are fairly similar. Again, the United States falls out of the top 20. But in virtually all cases, women on average live longer than men, and that's true for the U.S. average as well. The average woman lives almost 81 years in the United States. So what are the leading causes of death? This is specifically for the United States, and this data is from 2006. But for all age groups, the leading cause of death is heart disease, followed by cancer and cerebrovascular disease, which is basically a stroke. And then if this is broken down by age, for children and adolescents 5 to 14, the number one cause is accidents, followed by cancer and birth defects. And then for 25 to 44-year-olds, the leading cause is also accidents, and then cancer and heart disease. And then adults 65 and older, you'll notice that the top three are the same as the all ages category. That's because most of the deaths in this country do occur in people 65 and older. So the question then is, can mortality be affected by behavior, by lifestyle? And we're all aware that the answer is yes. For example, cigarette smoking, dieting, or what you eat, not necessarily diet as in restricting calories, but what you eat, how active you are, do you exercise, what's your stress level like, use of drugs and alcohol, and on and on and on. All of these behaviors affect our risk of mortality. What we're specifically going to be focusing on today is the relationship between physical activity, or some variation of that, as our exposure, and risk of mortality or death as our outcome. So what you see here is the relationship between, on the x-axis on this figure, the minutes per week of either moderate or vigorous intensity physical activity. So further to the right means more activity. And then the relative risk of mortality, of dying prematurely, on the y-axis. So a point that's lower on the figure means a lower risk. And so what you see here is that the more minutes per week of physical activity, the lower the risk of death. And this is a good example of a dose-response relationship. More physical activity, a greater dose of physical activity, if you will, is a greater reduced risk. And this is very similar data showing physical activity on the x-axis in kcals per week. So this is, kcals are what we typically just refer to as calories. So if you burn 500 calories a week being physically active versus 2,000, obviously the person who burns more calories being active is more physically active. And then you see the death rate on the y-axis, and again you see that more physical activity is linearly related to decreased risk of death. Now let's specifically talk about studies that were used to study the relationship between occupational physical activity and risk of mortality. So occupational physical activity is physical activity you do at work. And there is a classic study used to assess the risk of mortality with occupational physical activity. This was the U.S. railroad workers study. They studied a very large sample, over 191,000. They were all men who had worked in the U.S. railroad industry for at least 10 years. And what they did is they got data about their position. Either they were a clerk, which they considered to be a sedentary job. They were a switchman, which they considered to be active, and then section men were the most active. So essentially, the sample was divided into 3 groups: sedentary, active, or most active, and that was based on their job. And after they adjusted for age, because we know age is related to mortality risk, what they found is that the death rates for the sedentary group were 11.7, 10.3 for active, and the most active had a death rate of 7.6. So what this means is that being active, especially being classified as in the most active group, had a lower death rate than being sedentary. However, it's important to realize that we don't have any data on smoking, BMI, blood pressure, etc. So that's okay as long as the percentage of men who smoked was similar in the sedentary, active, and most active groups, and the BMIs were similar in sedentary, active, most active, and so on. But we don't know if that's true or not, so that can be a potential problem. Next, let's talk about a study that was used to study the relationship between recreational physical activity and risk of mortality. So recreational physical activity is just what it sounds like. It's physical activity done for recreational purposes. The study that we're going to talk about is called the Harvard Alumni Study, and this study consisted of more than 21,000 male alumni of Harvard University. They all have to be undergraduates sometime between 1916 and 1950. And what they did is they asked these men about the number of flights of stairs they climbed daily, the number of city blocks they walked daily, what types of sports and activities they participated in, and for what duration. So from this information that was provided, they were able to estimate an amount of recreational physical activity, and then they followed these men over time. This is a cohort design, and they saw over the years who died and who did not. They adjusted for age, smoking, BMI, blood pressure, and the age of parental death. This is a way to try to adjust for family history. And so what they found is that active men could expect to live about 2.15 years longer compared to inactive men, suggesting, of course, that recreational physical activity reduces risk of mortality. Similarly, the Iowa Women's Health Study basically did the same thing, only in women. The Harvard Alumni Study at the time, there were only males admitted to Harvard when the study was begun, and so that's why it consisted of males originally. So the Iowa Women's Health Study is a sample of about 40,000 postmenopausal women living in Iowa, and they all were between age 55 and 69 at the first time of data collection. And what they did is they classified them as either low, moderate, or high activity level. They determined that high activity was someone who did vigorous intensity twice a week at least, or moderate intensity activity at least 4 times a week. And so they adjusted for a whole number of potential confounders that you can look at, basically anything that they could think of that might affect mortality risk. They attempted to statistically adjust for, and what they found is that the women who had moderate physical activity levels had a relative risk of 0.77, or another way to think of that is a 23% reduced risk of mortality compared to the low active. And then the high active group had a 32% reduced risk, or a relative risk of 0.68. So again, recreational physical activity in women was associated with lower mortality. Next, let's talk about fitness. We've talked about physical activity, but remember, somebody can be physically fit and not necessarily be active, or vice versa. So how does fitness play into this? Fitness, remember, is the ability of the heart and lungs to bring oxygen into the body and then actually use that oxygen. So this study, what they did is they looked at people who were fit and people who were unfit. They just cut the sample in half as far as their fitness goes. And then they also looked within that at people who are considered lean by their BMI, normal weight, and obese. And so this figure is set up a little bit differently than the ones we've seen before. There's this dark dashed line at 1.0 going across horizontally. Anything above that line means that the risk of mortality is increased. Anything below that line means risk of mortality is decreased. And it means increased or decreased compared to our reference group, which is the lean and fit group. So you don't actually see a box for lean and fit because it's exactly equal to 1. So what this means is that compared to lean, fit individuals, people who are lean and unfit have about twice the risk of mortality. People who are normal weight, fit, actually have the lowest risk of all. You can see that little white box just below the 1.0 line. So they have a reduced risk compared to the lean fit. And the worst group to be in is the obese unfit. What I really want to draw your attention to is the obese fit group. There's a 75 on top of that bar. What you see there is that compared to lean and fit people, the obese fit people have a slightly higher risk of mortality, but they're obese, and yet they're not nearly as at risk as the obese unfit. What this suggests is that fitness is very protective against mortality, especially in obese people. And so even if someone is overweight or obese, encouraging them to increase their physical fitness may help their health even more than losing weight. This is showing very similar results. You can see that there's an unfit and a fit category, and then the gray bars are people who have a normal BMI, meaning they're not overweight, and then the black bars are BMI greater than 30, meaning overweight. And you can see that if they're fit, the obese people actually have barely different risk of mortality compared to the lean, fit people. So again, fitness seems to protect against mortality, especially in people who are obese. So the data that you saw on the previous slides comes from the Aerobics Center longitudinal study. They studied over 25,000 men and 7,000 women. And we've talked about this a little bit before, but the clinic is called the Cooper Clinic or the Cooper Institute. It's in Dallas. And what they do is people come to the clinic, they do a graded exercise test and all kinds of other health-related testing. Based on the results of their VO2 max test, they're broken into 5 groups based on fitness of the bottom 20%, 20 to 40%, and so forth. And then another study, there's a lot of studies based on this data, but another study showed that the least fit group, the bottom 20%, have 3.44 times the risk of mortality compared to those who are in the top fitness group. So fitness, again, seems to be very protective against mortality risk. There's another study called the Veterans Affairs Healthcare System Study, and it is unique because it was designed to study the relationship between fitness and mortality, specifically in blacks. The Cooper Center study is mostly white men, and so there's not as much information about women and minorities. So what they did in this study was they studied 6,700 and some black and 8,900 and some white men who received medical care at the VA hospital in Washington, D.C. and in Palo Alto. So what they found is that don't worry about what one MET exactly means. Basically, each unit increase in exercise capacity or in fitness, each unit increase in fitness was associated with a relative risk of 0.82, so an 18% reduced risk. So each incremental increase in fitness reduced your risk of mortality an extra 18%. And what they found in comparing blacks and whites is that the results were basically the same. So race did not appear to matter in terms of how fitness affects mortality risk. Next, let's talk about sedentary behavior, specifically sitting. This study what they did is they asked people, how much do you sit? And the choices were almost none of the time, a fourth of the time, half the time, 3/4 of the time, or almost all of the time. And then what they did is they followed these individuals over about 14 years. And if the line slopes downward very steeply, that means a lot of people in that group died. So if you look at the almost all of the time line, at about 12 years, only about 80% of those individuals had survived or were still alive. Whereas if you look at the almost none of the time line, about 95% of that sample had survived. So what you see here is that there's a very strong gradient or dose response with sitting time and risk of mortality. Next, let's talk about exercise intensity. Does it matter how intensely you exercise in terms of mortality risk? So I know there's a lot of numbers here, so I'm going to try to highlight the most important part. What you see here is the intensity of sports or recreational activities, and they're divided into none or light, moderate, and vigorous. And we're just going to really focus on the first column that at the top is labeled age-adjusted RR for relative risk. So the referent category is the none or light. So any number lower than 1 means a reduced risk compared to people who did no activity or light activity. So the moderate intensity group had a relative risk of 0.94, so about a 6% reduced risk, although if you look at the confidence interval, it includes 1, so that means that that reduction of 6% isn't actually statistically meaningful. But if you look at the vigorous intensity, group, the relative risk is 0.74. That means there's a 26% reduced risk for people who did vigorous intensity activity compared to those who did none or light. And that the confidence interval there does not include 1, so that value it's meaningful. If we look at the green box, this is the relative intensity. So this is just a different way that people determined how hard they were working. You can see that those who did moderate intensity had a reduced risk, but it wasn't statistically significant based on the confidence interval. But if they called their activity somewhat strong or strong to maximal, their risk of mortality was significantly reduced. So again, what this means is that more intense exercise has a greater protective effect against mortality. Today, you're going to participate in discussion number 3, and please remember that the extra credit quiz will close Friday just before midnight.